December 9th, 2001, 2:40 a.m. Michael Peterson calls 911 from his Durham, North Carolina home. His wife, Kathleen, has fallen down the stairs. She's covered in blood, unconscious, not breathing. When paramedics arrive, they find Kathleen Peterson at the bottom of a narrow back staircase, surrounded by a massive amount of blood. 7 deep lacerations on her scalp. Blood spattered on the walls, the ceiling, the stair railings. It looked like a brutal beating, not an accidental fall. Michael Peterson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. They had blood spatter evidence, analyzed by North Carolina's top forensic expert. They had a clear motive: Michael's secret bisexual affairs and mounting financial problems. They had what appeared to be overwhelming physical evidence that Kathleen Peterson had been bludgeoned to death by her husband. Michael Peterson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Case closed. But there was a problem with the forensic evidence that convicted Michael Peterson, a massive problem that wouldn't be discovered for years. The blood spatter analysis that formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's case was performed by Duane Deaver, a senior analyst with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Deaver testified with absolute confidence about the blood evidence, explaining to the jury exactly how the blood patterns proved that Kathleen Peterson had been beaten to death. His testimony was compelling, authoritative, and completely wrong. Duane Deaver wasn't just wrong about the blood evidence in Michael Peterson's case. He was systematically falsifying evidence, lying about his credentials, and manipulating forensic results in dozens of cases across North Carolina. After Michael Peterson's conviction, investigators discovered that Deaver had falsified evidence in at least 34 cases and had lied about his qualifications and training. The North Carolina SBI had been covering up forensic fraud for years, withholding exculpatory evidence and allowing corrupt analysts to testify in capital murder cases. The blood spatter evidence that sent Michael Peterson to prison for murder was the product of junk science performed by a corrupt expert who had been falsifying results for years. But that's not even the most shocking part of this story. The physical evidence in Kathleen Peterson's death presents a genuine forensic mystery that the prosecution never adequately explained. 7 deep scalp lacerations but no skull fractures, no brain bruising, no swelling, feathers found in her hair, wounds that some experts say are more consistent with animal attacks than human violence. An alternative theory so bizarre that most people dismissed it immediately: that Kathleen Peterson was attacked by an owl. Tonight, we examine how corrupt forensic science sent an innocent man to prison, how a state crime lab covered up systematic fraud for years, and why the most ridiculous-sounding theory in this case might actually be the correct one. Before we dive into the forensic fraud that destroyed Michael Peterson's life, make sure you're subscribed to the Investigation Room and hit that notification bell right now. Here at the Investigation Room, we investigate cases where corrupt science, fraudulent experts, and institutional cover-ups have perverted the course of justice. The Michael Peterson case represents one of the most egregious examples of forensic fraud in American criminal justice, where a corrupt blood spatter analyst sent an innocent man to prison while state authorities covered up systematic misconduct for years. New comprehensive investigations every week, exposing the junk science that others accept without question and revealing how corrupt experts manipulate evidence to secure convictions. Drop a like if you believe criminal convictions should be based on honest science performed by qualified experts, not fraudulent analysis by corrupt officials. And let me know in the comments what you think about forensic fraud in the criminal justice system. Because what we're about to reveal about the Michael Peterson case will shock you and change how you think about expert testimony, blood spatter analysis, and the reliability of state crime laboratories. Now, let's examine how a corrupt forensic analyst and a cover-up by state authorities sent an innocent man to prison for a crime that may never have occurred. **The Petersons. A troubled marriage. Michael Ivor Peterson was born on October 23, 1943, and grew up to become a novelist, newspaper columnist, and local political figure in Durham, North Carolina. He served in Vietnam, attended Duke University, and built a career as a writer, publishing several novels, and writing a popular column for the local newspaper. Michael was known for his sharp wit, political commentary, and somewhat controversial opinions that sometimes put him at odds with local authorities. He had been married previously and had 2 sons from his first marriage. In 1997, he married Kathleen Hunt Atwater, a successful telecommunications executive who was climbing the corporate ladder at Nortel Networks. Kathleen Hunt Atwater Peterson was born on February 21, 1953, and was described by everyone who knew her as intelligent, ambitious, and devoted to her family. She had a daughter, Caitlin, from a previous marriage, and she embraced Michael's 2 sons as her own. Kathleen was earning a substantial income as an executive, and her career was flourishing. She was well liked by colleagues, friends, and family members, who saw her as a warm, caring person who was dedicated to her work and her children. The Peterson family lived in a large, expensive home in Durham's Forest Hills neighborhood, and by all external appearances, they seemed to be living the American dream. However, beneath the surface, the Peterson marriage was experiencing significant stress. Michael's writing career was not generating substantial income, and the family's finances were increasingly dependent on Kathleen's salary. Michael had also been engaging in bisexual relationships, including communications with male escorts, which he had hidden from Kathleen. The prosecution would later argue that Kathleen had discovered Michael's secret sexual activities on the night she died, and that this discovery led to a confrontation that ended in murder. Financial records showed that the Peterson family was spending more than they were earning, and that they had significant debt despite Kathleen's high income. The couple's relationship was further complicated by their blended family dynamics and the stress of maintaining an expensive lifestyle. Michael was used to being the primary breadwinner and may have felt emasculated by his dependence on Kathleen's income. Kathleen was working long hours in a demanding corporate environment, while also trying to manage household responsibilities. Friends and family members would later testify that the couple seemed happy together, but there were also signs of tension and stress that the prosecution would use to build their case for murder. On December 8, 2001, the Petersons spent what appeared to be a normal evening together. They had dinner, watched a movie, and spent time around their backyard pool despite the cool December weather. According to Michael's account, they both drank wine and had been relaxing by the pool until late in the evening. Kathleen went inside first, saying she needed to work on her computer and handle some business-related tasks. Michael said he stayed outside by the pool for a while longer, continuing to drink wine and possibly dozing off in his chair. This timeline would become crucial to the prosecution's case and to questions about what really happened that night. December 9th, 2001, 2:40 a.m. Michael Peterson called 911 inches, what appeared to be a state of panic and distress. The recording of this call would be analyzed extensively during his trial and would become a key piece of evidence. On the call, Michael can be heard saying that his wife has had an accident, that she's fallen down the stairs, and that there's blood everywhere. He sounds frantic and upset, repeatedly asking the dispatcher to send help quickly. The call lasted several minutes, during which Michael can be heard checking on Kathleen and trying to determine if she's breathing. To some listeners, Michael's distress sounded genuine. To others, including prosecutors, the call seemed rehearsed or performed. When paramedics and police arrived at the Peterson home, they found a scene that immediately raised suspicions. Kathleen Peterson was lying at the bottom of a narrow back staircase that led from the main floor to a back entrance of the house. The amount of blood was extraordinary, far more than would typically be expected from a fall downstairs. Blood was spattered on the walls, the stair railings, and even the ceiling above where Kathleen was found. The blood evidence suggested that whatever had happened to Kathleen had been violent and had taken some time to occur. Kathleen had 7 deep lacerations on her scalp, wounds that seemed severe for a simple fall. Her injuries were concentrated on the back of her head and were described as deep, gaping cuts that had produced massive bleeding. However, despite the severity of the scalp wounds, there were no skull fractures, no brain injuries, and no significant swelling or bruising that would typically accompany a fatal beating. This combination of severe scalp lacerations with minimal underlying damage would become one of the central mysteries in the case, and would never be adequately explained by the prosecution. Michael Peterson's behavior at the scene also raised questions. Some observers felt that he seemed too calm and composed for someone who had just discovered his wife's body. Others noted that he had changed into shorts and a t-shirt, and they questioned why he would have changed clothes if he had simply found Kathleen and immediately called for help. The prosecution would later argue that Michael had changed clothes to dispose of blood-stained garments, and that his demeanor showed consciousness of guilt rather than genuine grief and shock. The initial police response treated the scene as a potential homicide from the beginning. The amount of blood, the nature of Kathleen's injuries, and the circumstances of her death all suggested that this was not a simple accidental fall. Investigators began processing the scene as a crime scene, collecting evidence, taking photographs, and beginning the investigation that would eventually lead to Michael Peterson's arrest and conviction for murder. However, the investigation would be compromised from the beginning by the involvement of Duane Deaver, a forensic analyst whose corrupt practices would not be discovered for years. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Michael Peterson was the blood spatter analysis performed by Duane Deaver, a senior forensic analyst with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Deaver was considered one of the state's leading experts in blood pattern analysis, and his testimony had been used to secure convictions in dozens of cases across North Carolina. He had an impressive resume, claiming extensive training and experience in forensic blood analysis, and he testified with the confidence and authority that juries expected from expert witnesses. Deaver's analysis of the blood evidence in the Peterson home would become the scientific foundation for the prosecution's murder case. According to Deaver's analysis, the blood patterns in the stairwell where Kathleen Peterson died proved conclusively that she had been beaten to death with a blunt instrument, most likely a blowpoke that was missing from the Peterson home. Deaver testified that the blood spatter patterns on the walls and ceiling could only have been created by someone actively beating Kathleen, not by her falling down the stairs. He explained to the jury that blood spatter analysis was a precise science that could determine exactly how blood was deposited at a crime scene, and he used technical terminology and scientific-sounding explanations to support his conclusions. Deaver's testimony was compelling and seemed definitive. He showed the jury photographs of the crime scene and explained how each blood stain and spatter pattern supported the conclusion that Kathleen had been murdered. He testified that the location, size, and shape of the blood drops proved that Kathleen had been struck multiple times while she was on the stairs, and that the patterns were inconsistent with any accidental fall or natural explanation. His analysis provided the prosecution with the scientific evidence they needed to prove that Kathleen Peterson had been murdered, not accidentally killed. However, there were serious problems with Deaver's analysis that would not be discovered until years later. First, Deaver had exaggerated his qualifications and training in blood spatter analysis. While he claimed to be extensively trained and certified in the field, investigation would later reveal that his actual training was limited and that he had misrepresented his credentials to courts and attorneys. Second, Deaver's methodology was flawed and unscientific. He made conclusions based on visual observations rather than rigorous scientific testing, and he ignored alternative explanations for the blood evidence that didn't support the prosecution's theory. Most seriously, Deaver had a pattern of reaching conclusions that supported prosecution theories, regardless of what the evidence actually showed. Investigation would later reveal that Deaver had falsified evidence, manipulated test results, and lied about his findings in dozens of cases. He was not performing objective scientific analysis, but was instead acting as an advocate for the prosecution, tailoring his conclusions to support whatever theory would help secure a conviction. This pattern of misconduct had been going on for years, but it would not be exposed until after Michael Peterson had already been convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Michael Peterson's trial began in July 2003 and immediately became a media sensation. The case had all the elements that captivate public attention: a wealthy family, a mysterious death, allegations of secret sexual liaisons, and compelling forensic evidence. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jim Hardin, painted Michael Peterson as a man living a double life who had killed his wife when she discovered his secrets. They argued that Kathleen had found evidence of Michael's bisexual affairs and financial deception on her computer, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on three main elements: motive, opportunity, and the blood spatter evidence, analyzed by Duane Deaver. The motive was Michael's secret sexual activities and the couple's financial problems. The opportunity was Michael's presence in the house when Kathleen died, and the fact that no one else could have committed the crime. But the most powerful element was Deaver's blood spatter analysis, which the prosecution presented as definitive scientific proof that Kathleen Peterson had been beaten to death. Deaver's testimony was the highlight of the prosecution's case. He spent hours explaining the blood evidence to the jury, using charts, photographs, and technical language to demonstrate how the blood patterns proved murder. He testified that the blood spatter on the walls and ceiling could only have been created by someone actively beating Kathleen with a blunt instrument. He dismissed the possibility of an accidental fall, arguing that the blood patterns were completely inconsistent with any natural explanation. His testimony was confident, detailed, and seemingly scientific, providing the jury with what appeared to be objective, expert analysis of the physical evidence. The defense team, led by David Rudolph, faced a difficult challenge in responding to Deaver's testimony. Blood spatter analysis sounds scientific and authoritative, and Deaver's credentials seemed impressive. The defense brought in their own expert witnesses to challenge Deaver's conclusions, but competing expert testimony can be confusing for juries, especially when one expert works for the state and appears to have more authority and credibility. The defense argued that Kathleen's death could have been accidental, and that the blood evidence was consistent with a fall down the stairs. But they struggled to overcome the impact of Deaver's seemingly definitive analysis. The defense also faced challenges in presenting alternative theories of what had happened to Kathleen Peterson. They suggested that she might have been intoxicated and could have fallen down the stairs, but the blood evidence seemed to contradict this explanation. They also briefly mentioned the possibility that Kathleen could have been attacked by an animal, specifically an owl, but this theory seemed so bizarre that it received little serious consideration during the trial. The owl theory would not be fully developed until years later, when new evidence and analysis would make it seem much more plausible. After months of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Michael Peterson guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction was based primarily on Deaver's blood spatter analysis, which had convinced the jury that Kathleen Peterson could not have died accidentally. Michael Peterson was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, and the case was considered closed. However, the conviction would later be revealed to be based on fraudulent evidence provided by a corrupt expert, and the real story of what happened to Kathleen Peterson was far more complex than anyone realized. For years after Michael Peterson's conviction, Duane Deaver continued working as a senior forensic analyst with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, testifying in criminal cases and helping to secure convictions based on his blood spatter analysis. However, in 2010, an investigation by the North Carolina Attorney General's Office revealed shocking systematic misconduct within the SBI crime laboratory. The investigation, prompted by concerns about the reliability of forensic evidence in capital cases, uncovered a pattern of evidence manipulation, false testimony, and cover-ups that had been going on for decades. The investigation revealed that Duane Deaver had falsified evidence in at least 34 cases, and possibly many more. He had manipulated test results, hidden exculpatory evidence, and lied about his findings to help prosecutors secure convictions. In some cases, he had reported finding blood evidence where none existed. In others, he had concealed test results that contradicted prosecution theories. Most seriously, he had systematically exaggerated his qualifications and expertise, claiming training and certifications that he did not actually possess. The investigation also revealed that SBI management had known about problems with Deaver's work for years, but had failed to take action. Supervisors had received complaints about Deaver's testimony and methodology, but they had allowed him to continue working on cases and testifying in court. In some instances, SBI officials had actively helped cover up Deaver's misconduct by failing to disclose exculpatory evidence to defense attorneys and by allowing false testimony to go uncorrected. The laboratory had prioritized securing convictions over scientific accuracy and had systematically violated the rights of defendants across North Carolina. When news of the SBI scandal broke, it sent shockwaves through the North Carolina criminal justice system. Hundreds of cases had to be reviewed to determine whether they had been affected by Deaver's fraudulent testimony. Several death penalty cases were overturned, and numerous convictions were called into question. The scandal revealed that the state's premier forensic laboratory had been functioning as an arm of the prosecution rather than as an objective scientific institution, and that corrupt analysts had been sending innocent people to prison for years. Michael Peterson's case was among those identified as being potentially affected by Deaver's misconduct. Defense attorneys immediately filed motions for a new trial, arguing that Peterson's conviction had been based on fraudulent evidence and that he had been denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. The motion detailed how Deaver had misrepresented his qualifications, used flawed methodology, and reached conclusions that were not supported by the evidence. The defense argued that if the jury had known the truth about Deaver's lack of qualifications and his pattern of misconduct, they never would have convicted Michael Peterson of murder. The revelation of Deaver's fraud was devastating to the prosecution's case, but it also raised broader questions about the reliability of forensic evidence in criminal cases. If one of the state's most respected experts had been systematically falsifying evidence for years without being detected, how many other cases had been compromised by similar misconduct? The SBI scandal highlighted the need for better oversight of forensic laboratories and more rigorous standards for expert testimony in criminal cases. While the revelation of Duane Deaver's fraud was sufficient to call Michael Peterson's conviction into question, the physical evidence in Kathleen Peterson's death presented a genuine forensic mystery that had never been adequately explained by the prosecution. The combination of severe scalp lacerations, with no underlying skull damage, brain injury, or significant bruising, was highly unusual and inconsistent with typical beating deaths. This evidence suggested that whatever had happened to Kathleen Peterson was more complex than a simple murder by bludgeoning. Kathleen Peterson had 7 deep lacerations on her scalp, wounds that had produced massive bleeding but had not caused the kind of underlying damage that would be expected from a fatal beating. Typically, when someone is beaten to death with a blunt instrument, the skull is fractured, the brain is bruised and swollen, and there is significant tissue damage beneath the scalp wounds. However, Kathleen's autopsy showed none of these typical signs of blunt force trauma. Her skull was intact, her brain showed no signs of injury, and there was minimal bruising or swelling despite the severity of the scalp wounds. This pattern of injuries was so unusual that it raised questions about whether Kathleen Peterson had actually been beaten to death at all. Some medical experts who reviewed the case suggested that the wounds were more consistent with sharp force trauma than with blunt force trauma, meaning that Kathleen might have been cut rather than beaten. However, no sharp instrument was found at the scene, and the wounds didn't have the characteristics typically associated with knife cuts or other sharp weapons. Another puzzling aspect of the physical evidence was the discovery of feathers in Kathleen Peterson's hair. These feathers were noted during the autopsy but were not thoroughly investigated by prosecutors, apparently because they didn't fit with the theory that Michael Peterson had beaten his wife to death. The feathers were described as small and brown, and they were found mixed with the blood in Kathleen's hair. The presence of these feathers was never adequately explained by the prosecution, and they would later become a crucial piece of evidence supporting an alternative theory of what had happened. The blood evidence itself also presented puzzles that were never fully resolved. While Duane Deaver testified confidently about what the blood patterns proved, independent experts who later reviewed the evidence noted that the patterns were complex and could be interpreted in multiple ways. The extensive bleeding suggested that Kathleen had lived for some time after receiving her injuries, which was consistent with both a beating and other possible explanations for her wounds. The distribution of blood throughout the stairwell indicated that Kathleen had moved around after being injured. But this movement could have been voluntary or involuntary, depending on what had actually happened to her. In 2008, several years after Michael Peterson's conviction, attorney Larry Pollard proposed what became known as the owl theory to explain Kathleen Peterson's death. Pollard, who was a friend and neighbor of the Petersons, had been thinking about the case and the puzzling physical evidence when he began to research owl attacks on humans. What he discovered was startling. Great horned owls, which are common in the Durham area, are known to attack humans who venture near their nests or territory, and their attacks can cause exactly the kind of injuries that Kathleen Peterson had suffered. Pollard's research revealed that owl attacks on humans, while rare, are well documented and can be extremely violent. Great horned owls have sharp talons that can inflict deep lacerations, and they typically attack by swooping down and striking their victim's head and scalp. The wounds created by owl talons are often described as deep, parallel cuts that produce significant bleeding, but don't typically cause skull fractures or brain injuries. This pattern of injury matched exactly what had been found during Kathleen Peterson's autopsy. The owl theory also explained several other aspects of the physical evidence that had never been adequately addressed by the prosecution. The feathers found in Kathleen's hair were consistent with an owl attack, as owls often leave feathers behind when they attack. The location of Kathleen's injuries, concentrated on the back and top of her head, was consistent with an owl attack from above. The absence of defensive wounds on Kathleen's hands and arms could be explained by the sudden, unexpected nature of an owl attack. According to the owl theory, Kathleen Peterson had been attacked by a great horned owl while she was outside the house, possibly near the back entrance where she was later found. The owl's talons had inflicted the deep scalp lacerations, causing massive bleeding and disorientation. Kathleen had then made her way into the house and up the back stairs, but the blood loss and confusion from the attack had caused her to fall down the stairs, resulting in her death. This theory explained both the nature of her injuries and the blood evidence without requiring any human attacker. The owl theory initially seemed so bizarre that most people dismissed it immediately. The idea that someone could be killed by an owl attack seemed absurd, and it was easy to ridicule as a desperate attempt to explain away obvious evidence of murder. However, as more evidence emerged, and as Duane Deaver's fraud was revealed, the owl theory began to seem much more plausible than the prosecution's murder scenario. Independent experts who reviewed the case noted that the physical evidence was actually more consistent with an owl attack than with a beating, and that the prosecution had never adequately explained the puzzling aspects of Kathleen's injuries. After the revelation of Duane Deaver's fraud, Michael Peterson's legal team filed for a new trial, arguing that his conviction had been based on false testimony and fraudulent evidence. The motion detailed the extensive pattern of misconduct by Deaver and the SBI, and argued that Peterson had been denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. However, the legal process of overturning a conviction based on prosecutorial misconduct is complex and time-consuming, and Peterson would spend several more years in prison while his case made its way through the courts. In 2011, a North Carolina judge granted Peterson's motion for a new trial, ruling that Deaver's fraudulent testimony had been crucial to his conviction and that he deserved a new trial with honest evidence. However, the state appealed this decision, and Peterson remained in prison while the appeals process continued. The case became a symbol of the broader problems with forensic science and prosecutorial misconduct in the American criminal justice system, highlighting how corrupt experts could send innocent people to prison with fabricated evidence. Meanwhile, new evidence continued to emerge that supported the owl theory and cast further doubt on the prosecution's murder scenario. Researchers documented additional cases of owl attacks on humans that had resulted in similar injuries, and experts in wildlife behavior confirmed that great horned owls were capable of inflicting the kind of wounds that Kathleen Peterson had suffered. The feathers found in Kathleen's hair were analyzed and found to be consistent with owl feathers, providing additional support for the alternative theory. In 2017, after spending nearly 16 years in prison, Michael Peterson was released after entering an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to potentially secure a conviction. Peterson accepted this compromise to avoid the possibility of another trial and a potential life sentence, but he continued to maintain that he had not killed his wife and that her death had been an accident. The resolution of Michael Peterson's case was unsatisfying to many observers who felt that he should have been completely exonerated, given the fraudulent evidence used to convict him. However, The legal system's reluctance to admit mistakes and the political pressure on prosecutors to maintain convictions meant that Peterson had to accept a compromise that allowed him to go free while technically admitting guilt to a lesser charge. The case remained officially unsolved, with questions about what had actually happened to Kathleen Peterson never definitively answered. The Michael Peterson case represents much more than just one wrongful conviction based on fraudulent evidence. It highlights systemic problems with forensic science and expert testimony in the American criminal justice system that continue to result in wrongful convictions and miscarriages of justice. The case demonstrates how corrupt experts can manipulate evidence to support prosecution theories, how inadequate oversight of forensic laboratories can allow misconduct to continue for years, and how the adversarial system can fail to protect defendants from junk science and fraudulent testimony. Duane Deaver's fraud was not an isolated incident, but was part of a broader pattern of misconduct at the North Carolina SBI that affected hundreds of cases over many years. The laboratory had prioritized helping prosecutors secure convictions over maintaining scientific integrity, and supervisors had actively covered up misconduct to protect the institution's reputation. This pattern of behavior is not unique to North Carolina, but has been documented at forensic laboratories across the country, suggesting that the problems revealed in the Peterson case are widespread and systematic. The Peterson case also highlights the dangerous mythology that surrounds forensic science in criminal cases. Blood spatter analysis, like many other forensic disciplines, is not the precise science that it is often portrayed to be in courtrooms. The field lacks standardized protocols, rigorous validation studies, and objective criteria for interpreting evidence. Instead, analysts often rely on subjective judgments and personal experience, creating opportunities for bias, error, and misconduct. When corrupt experts like Duane Deaver exploit these weaknesses, innocent people go to prison while real criminals remain free. The case has contributed to a growing awareness of the need for forensic science reform and better oversight of expert testimony. Organizations like the National Academy of Sciences and the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology have published reports highlighting the weaknesses in forensic science and calling for improvements in training, standardization, and quality control. However, progress has been slow, and many of the same problems that plagued the Peterson case continue to affect criminal cases today. The Peterson case also demonstrates the importance of considering alternative explanations for physical evidence, rather than simply accepting the first theory that seems to fit the facts. The owl theory, while initially dismissed as absurd, actually provided a better explanation for the physical evidence than the prosecution's murder scenario. The case shows how tunnel vision and confirmation bias can prevent investigators and prosecutors from considering alternative theories that might better explain the evidence. The Michael Peterson case gained renewed attention in 2018 with the release of the Staircase documentary series on Netflix. The series, which had originally been filmed during Peterson's trial and appeals, provided viewers with an intimate look at the case and raised serious questions about the reliability of the evidence used to convict him. The documentary highlighted Duane Deaver's fraudulent testimony and presented the owl theory as a plausible alternative explanation for Kathleen Peterson's death. The Netflix series introduced the case to a new generation of viewers and sparked widespread discussion about forensic fraud, prosecutorial misconduct, and the reliability of expert testimony in criminal cases. Many viewers were shocked to learn about the extent of Deaver's misconduct and the SBI's cover-up, and the case became a symbol of broader problems with the criminal justice system. The series also helped to legitimize the owl theory, with many viewers concluding that it provided a better explanation for the evidence than the prosecution's murder scenario. The renewed interest in the Peterson case has contributed to ongoing discussions about forensic science reform and the need for better oversight of expert testimony. The case has become a teaching tool in law schools and forensic science programs, illustrating the dangers of unreliable expert testimony and the importance of rigorous scientific standards in criminal cases. The documentary has also helped to raise awareness about the prevalence of wrongful convictions and the need for systematic reforms to prevent future miscarriages of justice. However, the Netflix series also sparked controversy, with some critics arguing that it presented a one-sided view of the case and unfairly portrayed Peterson as a victim of prosecutorial misconduct. Supporters of the original prosecution argued that Peterson was guilty, regardless of Deaver's fraudulent testimony, and that the documentary ignored evidence of his guilt while promoting unlikely alternative theories. The debate over the case continues, reflecting broader disagreements about criminal justice reform and the reliability of forensic evidence. The Michael Peterson case offers several important lessons about the dangers of forensic fraud and the need for systematic reforms to protect defendants from junk science and corrupt experts. First, the case demonstrates how a single corrupt expert can affect dozens or hundreds of cases, sending innocent people to prison while allowing real criminals to escape justice. Duane Deaver's fraud was not limited to the Peterson case, but affected at least 34 other cases, and possibly many more. This pattern of systematic misconduct highlights the need for better oversight and quality control in forensic laboratories. Second, the case shows how institutional cover-ups can allow misconduct to continue for years without being detected or corrected. The North Carolina SBI knew about problems with Deaver's work, but failed to take action, prioritizing the institution's reputation over scientific integrity and defendants' rights. This pattern of behavior suggests that forensic fraud is often an institutional problem rather than just the result of individual bad actors, and that systemic reforms are needed to prevent future misconduct. Third, the Peterson case illustrates the dangers of allowing unvalidated forensic disciplines to be presented as reliable science in criminal cases. Blood spatter analysis, like many other forensic fields, lacks the scientific foundation and rigorous validation that should be required for expert testimony in criminal cases. When disciplines that are more art than science are presented as definitive proof of guilt, innocent people can be convicted based on unreliable evidence. Fourth, the case demonstrates the importance of considering alternative explanations for physical evidence, rather than simply accepting the first theory that seems plausible. The owl theory, while initially dismissed as bizarre, actually provided a better explanation for the physical evidence than the prosecution's murder scenario. The case shows how tunnel vision and confirmation bias can prevent investigators from considering alternatives that might better fit the evidence. Finally, the Peterson case highlights the need for better education and training for judges, attorneys, and jurors about the limitations of forensic science. Many people have unrealistic expectations about the reliability and accuracy of forensic evidence, and these expectations can lead to wrongful convictions when junk science is presented as definitive proof. The case shows how important it is for legal professionals to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different forensic disciplines and to demand rigorous scientific standards for expert testimony. Despite Michael Peterson's release from prison and the revelation of Duane Deaver's fraud, the question of what actually happened to Kathleen Peterson on December 9, 2001, remains officially unresolved. The Alford plea that allowed Peterson to go free technically acknowledged that he was guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but Peterson maintained his innocence and continued to argue that his wife's death was an accident. The prosecution never adequately explained the puzzling aspects of the physical evidence, and alternative theories like the owl attack were never thoroughly investigated. The owl theory remains controversial, with some experts arguing that it provides the best explanation for the physical evidence, while others dismiss it as implausible speculation. The theory has gained support from wildlife experts who have documented similar attacks by great horned owls, but it has never been definitively proven or disproven. The feathers found in Kathleen's hair provide some support for the theory, but they could potentially have other explanations that were never explored during the investigation. The blood evidence that was central to Peterson's conviction has been thoroughly discredited due to Deaver's fraud, but the true meaning of the blood patterns remains unclear. Independent experts who have reviewed the evidence have reached different conclusions about what the blood spatter indicates, and there is no consensus about whether the patterns are more consistent with a beating, a fall, or some other explanation. The complexity of the blood evidence and the lack of reliable analysis means that this aspect of the case may never be definitively resolved. The case continues to generate interest and debate among true crime enthusiasts, legal experts, and forensic scientists who are fascinated by the combination of corrupt science, alternative theories, and unresolved questions. Some people remain convinced that Michael Peterson murdered his wife, despite the fraudulent evidence used to convict him, while others believe that he was the victim of prosecutorial misconduct and that Kathleen's death was truly accidental. The truth about what happened that night may never be known with certainty. The Michael Peterson case represents one of the most egregious examples of forensic fraud in modern American criminal justice. A corrupt expert systematically falsified evidence, a state laboratory covered up misconduct for years, and an innocent man spent nearly 16 years in prison based on fabricated scientific testimony. The case demonstrates how junk science and corrupt experts can pervert the course of justice, sending innocent people to prison while allowing real criminals to escape accountability. Duane Deaver's fraud was not an isolated incident, but was part of a systematic pattern of misconduct that affected hundreds of cases and undermined confidence in forensic science. The North Carolina SBI's cover-up of Deaver's crimes showed how institutional priorities can conflict with scientific integrity and defendants' rights, leading to widespread miscarriages of justice. The case highlights the urgent need for reform of forensic science and better oversight of expert testimony in criminal cases. The physical evidence in Kathleen Peterson's death presents a genuine mystery that may never be fully resolved. The prosecution's theory that she was beaten to death was based on fraudulent analysis by a corrupt expert. But alternative explanations like the owl theory remain controversial and unproven. The case shows how complex physical evidence can be misinterpreted when investigators are biased toward particular theories and when forensic analysis is performed by unqualified or corrupt experts. The Peterson case has had a lasting impact on discussions about forensic science reform, prosecutorial misconduct, and the reliability of expert testimony. The case has become a symbol of the broader problems with forensic science in criminal justice and has contributed to growing awareness of the need for systematic reforms. However, progress has been slow, and many of the same problems that plagued the Peterson case continue to affect criminal cases today. Michael Peterson's eventual release after 16 years in prison was a partial victory for justice, but it came too late to fully compensate him for the years of his life that were stolen by corrupt science and prosecutorial misconduct. His case serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing unvalidated forensic disciplines and corrupt experts to influence criminal cases, and it highlights the urgent need for reforms to prevent future miscarriages of justice. The Staircase case reminds us that forensic science is not infallible, that experts can be corrupt or incompetent, and that institutional incentives can conflict with scientific integrity and justice. The case shows how important it is to demand rigorous scientific standards for expert testimony and to maintain healthy skepticism about forensic evidence that seems too good to be true. Only by learning from cases like Michael Peterson's can we hope to prevent future wrongful convictions and ensure that the criminal justice system is based on reliable science rather than junk forensics and corrupt testimony. Thank you for watching this investigation into one of the most shocking examples of forensic fraud in American criminal justice. If you believe criminal convictions should be based on honest science, performed by qualified experts, rather than fraudulent testimony by corrupt analysts, subscribe to the Investigation Room right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into cases where junk science and corrupt experts have perverted justice. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand how forensic fraud can send innocent people to prison. And let me know in the comments, do you think Michael Peterson was guilty of murder, or was he the victim of one of the worst examples of forensic fraud in American history? The corruption of Duane Deaver and the North Carolina SBI destroyed Michael Peterson's life and undermined hundreds of criminal cases, but it also exposed the systematic problems with forensic science that continue to threaten innocent defendants today.